Yorkshire. So, lieutenant.
It's lieutenant, actually.
Before, you know, aren't we doing well? Well, on this one, though, slight apologies, because in the confusion of email exchanges, I got him the wrong title for his talk. So we've got the title. He will tell us about the railway that never was. Bradford missed its chance. Well, I don't know, that could be read in more ways than one.
Well, yeah, look at it, yeah.
But he is also the authority, I am told, on everything you ever wanted to know about the Keighley and Worth Valley Railway. He's written the definitive book, has been chairman of the Keighley and Worth Valley in the past. Don't know if you are at the moment. He's vice chairman now.
I was vice chairman.
Oh, you was vice chairman, but I'm told he's written the definitive work on the history. So over to you.
Thank you very much. As industrial archaeologists, you were probably expecting something that you could see rather than something that never happened. But in fact, you can see most of this that never happened. There's just a bit in the middle of the city that you can't see, although if you want to go for a poke about tonight in the dark, I'm sure you'd enjoy it, and you can see where it nearly happened. That's a map of West Yorkshire's railways, and somebody rumbled me and said that's out of David Joy's book, The Regional History, and it is. I've stolen the map. I'm sorry, David, who knows me, so he won't mind. That's what it was like here in 1922. And can you hear me all right with this? There's a terrible echo on this thing. Is it all right? Yeah. And this is Bradford here. Can you see it? This little red thing going around it. And you can barely see there in Bradford a little gap between Bradford Exchange and Bradford Foster Square. Well, you're in Foster Square now. This is one of Trubshaw's triumphs. Charles Trubshaw designed this place, and what a place it is. For those of you who've not sussed it out, it's where Sir Henry Irving died, and the theatrical chap. And it was built in 1894 as the crown on, the Midlands Crown in Bradford, and it was the place to come to. And it's quite a hell of a building, despite the chips. And the Midland finished here, and the Midland had the view, the Midland Railway had a view that this was the end of its main line. Part of it went to London from here, part of it went to Bristol, both sharing a common route as far as Derby, and the other part of it went to Carlisle, and then eventually via running powers onto Glasgow and Edinburgh. So Bradford was absolutely at the heart of the Midland system. The same applies to Leeds. And as with Bradford, you had to come in and go out, which they regularly did. It was a sort of Y reversal, the lines divided at Shipley. Same with Leeds on the Midland, they divided at Holbeck. And those of you who are going back down south via Leeds, you'll see the junction, the Midland junctions at Holbeck. The other side of Bradford belonged to the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway and the Great Northern Railway. And if we just look at this, this is I'm quite proud of this. I found it on the internet. I don't know who I stole it from, but it's really rather good. That's Bradford at the centre of it there. Haworth is over here. That's where I live, in the Worth Valley. So I have nothing to do with Bradford at all. It's not my fault. This is the Aire Valley coming down here. Can you see this little red thing? I'm very proud of this little red thing. It's really rather good. And going down to Leeds. So that's the Aire Valley, yeah? And then the Settle Carlisle line goes off from Skipton up that way. You've got Bradford in its little basin here. And you've got a huge lump of earth. I'm not sure what it's called, a hill. And then you've got down here, this is the Calder Valley, running through Hebden Bridge and Sowerby Bridge, eventually coming out at Wakefield, down to Normanton. There's Wakefield. And the Midland comes up from Sheffield through Wakefield. And we've got, if I can press the right button, a series of gaps. You've two gaps in the West Riding. First of all, you've got the famous Bradford Gap that never had a railway across it, between Foster Square, which is where we are now, and Exchange Station. Now, one or two of you have been talking to me over lunch and said you came into Interchange, Bradford Interchange, which is a magnificent thing. It rivals St Pancras. I presume most of you have seen it. Ghastly, awful thing it is. Well, that's actually on the site of Bridge Street Goods. It was the L&Y Goods station. And the exchange station was rather nearer the city centre, about twice as near as it is. Somebody just said it was about a third of a mile. Well, it was within sight of Foster Square was the old exchange station. So it was about 150 yards from here, between the buffer stops, which is quite incredible when you think about it. You couldn't see across because there were a couple of office blocks in the way, but if they hadn't been there, it would have been, you know, you almost shout across. But there was also a much bigger gap in the West Riding on the Midlands system itself. And that was where the railway kinked round the West Riding. And I'm going to show you a map about that in a minute. And there were two efforts to link Bradford, to fill the local Bradford gap, for want of a better term. One in 1846, which involved George Hudson and failed dismally, and one in 1884 that involved the local council, which failed dismally. And after the 1884 attempt, the Midland Gap was the driver in trying to put a railway through Bradford. And there you are. I keep coming back to these little maps. If I go on too much, I'm sorry, but this is the Midland here coming in from Leeds, and this is a rather splendid piece of cartography. The Midland had its own cartographic department run by a bloke called Mr. Clay, and they had a van, and these four blokes used to travel around the system in this van, mapping the Midland. Nobody knows why they did it, but they started in 1890 and they carried on till after the First World War. And this is part of the Midlands famous land plans and route plans. And you can see the gap there very clearly. That's Exchange, where my little red dot is now, and that's Foster Square, and that's about 150 yards. Exchange was used by the Great Northern and the Lancashire and Yorkshire, with occasional visits from the Great Central Railway and the London and North Western, both of which had running powers. And Midland was exclusively Midland. That's probably a better explanation of the Midland Gap. This is the line coming up from Derby and St Pancras. Can you see it? If you follow that there, you see there's a huge kink as it goes round the West Riding. You see that? Into Leeds, where it reversed, then out again, and then up north. Now, the gap, as regards the Midland, was here. It was from Bradford to Royston. That's Royston there. It's about 20 miles, something like that. And if they could put a railway in over that line, over that route, or indeed round that way into Keighley, somewhere near Keighley, it would cut off 20, 25 miles through West Yorkshire. And it would give them a route that was competitive with the West Coast Main Line. They weren't bothered about local traffic. The Midland thought strategically. And it wasn't actually all that bothered about owning its own route, as long as it had a route. If it was somebody else's route and they could use what we call running powers, they were perfectly happy, as long as they could control their own trains. This is a bit boring, really. It's the first railway into Bradford was the Leeds and Bradford that came up the Aire Valley from what's now Leeds City, but used to be called Leeds Wellington. If you've been into platforms 0 to 5 at Leeds, that's more or less what was Leeds Wellington. There's even some Midland canopies up there. And it came to Bradford into a station here that was called Market Street at the time. And then the first railway from Bradford was the extension line of that Leeds and Bradford extension from here out to Colne, and that's the one through Keighley. So those of you who are going on the Worth Valley excursion on Wednesday will be going on the extension line when you get to Keighley. Those of you who are missing out, I can only query your sanity, but anyway, that's your affair. Again, that's another sort of local look at the Midlands operations round here. You've got Leeds there, you've got the main line up the Aire Valley there. Skipton, this was built partly to give 4 tracks to Skipton, because you couldn't get 4 tracks, there wasn't enough room up the Aire Valley, and partly to keep the North Eastern Railway, which finished at Otley, out of Skipton and away from the west coast. That was the main reason for building that line through Bolton Abbey and Addingham. That and the Duke of Devonshire wanted a railway to Bolton Abbey as well. Some of these are a bit superfluous, but we'll go through them anyway. This is the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway in dark. As you can see, it comes down the Calder Valley here and then up into Bradford Exchange. It had a line up the Spen Valley there. So if you like, this is the lump that you saw on the relief map, and it went down to Wakefield and eventually to Normanton. and it used running powers then to York and into Leeds, Leeds Central. And it had a bit of track there between Bradford and Leeds. And the Great Northern was almost superimposed on that. It came later, it came about 10 years after everybody else, 20 years after the mid, and it dropped on top of all, it had the most phenomenal civil engineering works to build these routes, all of which duplicated everything else. And I sometimes think, frankly, the Great Northern's corporate sanity needs looking at, because you can still see all this system. If you go wandering around, if you have nothing else to do with your life, you go to Batley and have a look at the engineering works in Batley and Dewsbury. I think you're bonkers if you do, but anyway, it's all there. I've done it, so I must be bonkers. But you can see there's Bradford again there. They built these peculiar routes like that thing around the back of the city, round to Shipley, which, you know, why they did it, God knows. But Bradford's importance as a railway centre, it's the only city of any size in the UK that is on the end of a branch line. In fact, it's on the end of 2 branch lines. It's the 7th largest city in the UK. And as a result, whoever owned these branch lines, it was unbelievably difficult to operate them, because whenever your train arrived at Bradford, you had to take the engine off and put it on the other end, or you had to have another engine waiting, which duplicated facilities. That meant you needed lots of engine sheds, lots of staff, lots of everything. And you were inevitably going to cover the same route a couple of times as you got out of the city. But it didn't really matter, because Bradford was so rich. You can tell that by the look of this place. This was built in 1894, the absolute apogee of Bradford's wealth. And it was the first place in Britain to have a Pullman car service. Everybody know what a Pullman is? I rabbited on about this some time ago in London, and then somebody put their hand up and said, "What's a Pullman car, please?" So is everybody happy what a Pullman is? Yeah, good. It's a dead posh coach, basically. Likes of me would never travel in that because it's for rich people. It was on the Midland, it sold more first-class tickets than any other station on the Midland. It was so rich. It had first-class only trains running from it to St Pancras and Bristol for the wool sales in Bristol. And I don't know of anybody else who ran an all first-class train anywhere, but it was only from Bradford. Because of the branch line status, as you can see there, everything out of here was duplicated. You had endless problems, because everything from Leeds that went north, there was a train from Bradford that went north, and they were constantly splitting them, putting them together at places like Skipton and Hellifield and that sort of thing. Services to most of the West Riding towns ran from here. They ran to London, to Scotland, points in between, and services down to Bristol. And they were all duplicated. Bristol in the West Country. I keep talking about Bristol in the West Country. It was fine, was that, as long as Bradford was rich and there was loads and loads of traffic. But the minute that the traffic started to drop off, or there wasn't the need for competition, which happened after the 1923 grouping of the railways, and there ceased to be, for example, the London and North Western competing with the Midland for traffic, in that case down to the West Country, suddenly it all became superfluous, and it was managed decline then after that. And the need for a railway through Bradford, the strategic need that the Midland had to get its trains from Bristol and London to Scotland quickly, and for Ireland as well, which I'll come on to in a minute, it just went, because the LMS that succeeded the London North Western and the Midland simply had no interest. Why should we build a railway through Bradford when we don't need it? We'd be competing with ourselves. It's bonkers. And that was the problem. That's what was Market Street Station in Bradford at its height in 1894. I keep going on about 1894, but this is not long after the trams were electrified. So you're probably talking about 1905, 1906 here, something like that. And the building that we're in now is that thing with that strange tower on. The bloke who designed this place is called Trubshaw, Charles Trubshaw. And if Trubshaw liked one thing, it was twiddly bits in architecture. If he would never, ever just put a straightforward gable roof on. Those of you who are going to Keighley, and those of you who aren't, you must want your sanity testing. But anyway, on Wednesday, have a look at Keighley Station. That's a Trubshaw building. Have a look at the roof here when you go outside, if you dare. And it's really, really scary. There's little pinnacles and flat bits and gables and glass bits and God knows what. And you can see there a little bit of it that Trubshaw put on here. He then put this massive curtain wall up, which was covered, and then behind it was a 9-platform terminus station. It was huge. That's the other view. That's when I was a kid in the 1960s. You can see the size of it. That wall, where's my little red thing? That wall there is actually still there. You can still see that. We're over here, and this is the present station just here, which they've just expanded to 4 platforms from 3, and there's room for another 2 yet to go in. That was one of the biggest signal boxes on the Midland. Down here is where they kept all the carriages, there the carriage works. That's the goods station, or one of the 3 goods stations that were here. It was just colossal. That's Bradford Exchange, 150 yards away from Foster Square. In fact, Foster Square is just there. Can you see the little red thing is? Virtual duplicate of it, apart from the roof, with this massive goods, that's Bridge Street goods station. That's where the interchange is now. And I was talking to a gentleman just before we came on, and he said he walked from interchange, which is there, through the city centre to Foster Square, which is just about there. It's about half a mile now. You can imagine it used to be a matter of a few hundred yards. And that's the gap. There's the gap. Foster Square there, Exchange there. Can you see it? Bonkers, isn't it? Absolutely crazy. The original Great Northern Station and L&Y station in Bradford was just here, a place called Adolphus Street. You can just see it, but it was too far outside the city, so it only lasted a few years. But it was there until a matter of a few years ago, and it's now a slaughterhouse, and it smells. And there's an awful smell sometimes. That's the Midlands own system, and you can see there's a huge gap there between the London Main Line and the West, what used to be called the West Main Line. But it goes down there to Bournemouth using financial controls. It controlled that railway there, the Midland and South Western Junction, down to Southampton. It had a half share in a railway out there into East Anglia called the Midland and Great Northern. It half owned the Somerset and Dorset. It owned the Tilbury line from Fenchurch Street, although Fenchurch Street wasn't owned by it. It had a peculiar route into South Wales there, which nobody ever used, but carried vast amounts of coal and tin. And it had a massive network in Northern Ireland. It was the biggest single narrow gauge railway owner in Western Europe. Not a lot of people know that about the Midland, but it was. And a fifth of its mileage was in Northern Ireland. That's its main competitor, the London and North Western. And this is the West Coast Main Line coming from almost literally next door to St Pancras, going up to Scotland that way. And of course, the Midlands Main Line goes through Leeds down to St Pancras that way. So you can see it's lethal competition. Also, they've got a route to Holyhead, whereas the Midland had a route to Stranraer. So they're competing for the same Irish traffic as well. You might say, where the hell does the Great Western come into this? Actually, not a lot of people know, but the Great Western ran a very regular train service to Manchester. Its engines were stationed at Patrickcroft Shed, and there was a train about every half hour from Manchester Exchange, effectively Victoria, out to Warrington and Chester. You regularly saw Swindon engines in Exchange. There were about 8 stationed at Patrickcroft, and it advertised a service from Paddington to Manchester. There were 4 trains a day, 4 through trains a day. But the main service was Manchester to Chester and Manchester to Shrewsbury. Now, here, just south of Manchester, is Stockport. And at Stockport, the London and North Western Railway came in from Bradford and Leeds. Can you see what's going to happen here? As soon as the Great Western's broad gauge was done away with, there was a standard gauge line from the West Riding to the West Country. And that competed with the Midlands route to the West Country, which went, sorry if I can just go back to that, which went that way. And at Templecombe there, it connected with the South Western Railway that took its trains to Exeter and Plymouth. Can you see the threat to it? It's got to have a fast route through the centre of the country if it's going to compete. The Great Northern competed for the London traffic. That's the Great Northern there, straight into Leeds and Bradford. And the last straw in the Midlands book was the building of the Great Central, which linked this part of the world with Marylebone. And the Great Central had a line to Banbury, and at Banbury it connected with the Great Western, so it was a second route to the west, threatening the Midlands West traffic. So in 1899, we had this situation. You got Midland routes from Bradford going to all these places that are listed there. You'd got the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway, much of which was joint with the North Western Railway, to Manchester, Liverpool, Hull, all sorts of places like that. And astonishingly, through coaches to St Pancras on the L&Y. And you had the Great Northern route, which was by far the fastest route to London from here. There were a lot more strategic issues involved because the North Western had a fast route from Euston right the way to the north of Scotland, known as the West Coast Alliance. The Great Northern was the leading partner in the East Coast Alliance from London up to Edinburgh and Glasgow, Inverness and beyond. And almost as important was the Irish traffic. London and North Western had Euston to Holyhead and Leeds to Liverpool. Without that fast through route through West Yorkshire that was delaying its trains, all of this on the Midland, all this traffic was threatened by this grand alliance of all the other companies. Oh yeah, just as an example, you might think, well, this is all a bit remote, is this? But there was a wool buyers special every 3 weeks to coincide with the wool sales in Bristol. And this wool buyers special was run by the Midland, and everybody went on it. And then once we got the Severn Tunnel opened and the Great Western had removed the broad gauge, the London and North Western started a wool buyers special from here to Stockport, Stockport to Stalybridge, Stalybridge to Stockport, and then down the North Western as far as Shrewsbury, and then the Great Western took it over Shrewsbury down, and it was a huge race who would get there first, and it was intensely competitive. The best trains of both companies went on that line, all first class, and in fact the Midland won. It was the quickest route, but nonetheless, something like that, it just shows the intense competition there was. You'd all sorts of other competitive routes as well. The big problem that the Midland had was the money that they'd invested. They'd got 3 Irish ports, astonishingly. They'd invested a vast amount of money in Port Patrick, which didn't work, and very quickly they moved to Stranraer. They'd spent a fortune at Barrow, using the Furness Railway to get there from Carnforth. And that was their main Irish port, and they had trains from all over the country to Barrow. From Barrow, you could go, there were some transatlantic ships for a while from Barrow, but mostly to the Isle of Man and to Northern Ireland. 3 ports in Northern Ireland were served. They'd spent 3 million on the Settle-Carlisle line to get trains to Carlisle and eventually to Stranraer and Glasgow and Edinburgh. They gave vast subsidies to the North British Railway to take their coaches from Carlisle to Edinburgh. They'd paid for 1/3 of the Forth Bridge. And the Forth Bridge, if you think about it, was an extremely expensive venture. The Midland paid for 1/3 of it, even though it had no connection, physical connection with it at all. They were pumping money into the Glasgow and South Western, that's the GSWR, to keep it solvent, and it ran its trains from took Midland trains through to Glasgow. It had bought a half share in the Somerset and Dorset Railway in the 1870s, which took its trains to Bournemouth, and from Templecombe, the South Western went on to Exeter, and it had made a colossal loan of £500,000 to the Midland and South Western, give the Midland control over it, to give a route to Southampton, principally for the coal traffic. And now the Great Central had duplicated everything. It had big problems with this kink through the middle of West Yorkshire. It had to get rid of it. There've been several efforts to get rid of the gap locally, all of which had failed. And then in the 1890s, about 1894, I think it was, the Midland finally promoted a route through through West Yorkshire that looked as if it was going to work. The idea was that goes down to Royston Junction there on the Sheffield-Leeds line. And there were two possible routes. There was this one up here, which comes up through Dewsbury to a place called Low Moor, just south of Bradford. And those of you who've come up the M606, I don't know if anybody has done, if you've driven up the M606, that's built on this route. That was actually going to be the route. And then it went into a tunnel at the top of Bradford and then dropped down an incredibly steep tunnel, about 1 in 40. Came out on a viaduct around the back of Foster Square and then joined the Midland line just beyond Foster Square. Or it could have done that, built on there with a station in Huddersfield, and then eventually up round the back of Halifax and then off that way to Keighley, round about there. And that way it would have cut that, you know, that massive kink you saw in West Riding, and it would have, the traffic would have just flowed straight through. Either way would do it. That would be the cheaper way through Bradford. But you've got a problem that the city's in the middle. That's just a little bit more of an explanation of it. It will give, the 1898 Act gave a new main line from Royston Junction, because that was the route they decided on through Bradford, on the Sheffield-Leeds line to Thornhill. They were going to build a branch to Huddersfield, which was actually built, but never finished. The line from Royston was going to go up here through Bradford, and that was actually built as far as Dewsbury, which is there. So if you fancy a little bit of industrial archaeology, when you go down the M1 on your way home today, if you are doing, just after you've dropped into the Calder Valley and you climb up, gentleman mentioned Woolly Colliery earlier on, you start to climb up and you're not far from Woolly there. As you go out of the Calder Valley, just before the services at the top there, you go over a bridge, and underneath there is that line, which has hardly ever been used to Huddersfield and up to Bradford, which never got any further than Dewsbury. And have a 2-mile tunnel under it through Bradford, can you imagine? These are the advantages of it. It got rid of that kink on the Midland, that crowded main line north of Royston and south of Shipley. There'd be no need to expand the facilities on that part of the route, which were very urban, and it would have been very, very expensive to expand them. The gradients, virtually non-existent, was more or less straight. In those days, it was certainly competitive with the Great Central that was built as a high-speed line, and it avoided the absolute pain of having to reverse at Leeds. It put Bradford on a through route from London to Scotland, from Liverpool to Newcastle, and everywhere in between. And one Midland director, speaking in this hotel, quite possibly in this room, when he was telling the local Chamber of Commerce about it, he just stood there very self-satisfied and said, the range of train services will become limitless. And the audience erupted. And it was probably in this room. I've gone all tingly now, all unnecessary. Another advantage, it would bring Bradford 11 miles nearer, and that's the West Riding, 11 miles nearer to St Pancras. The St Pancras to Scotland route will be made 16 miles shorter and more direct and far more competitive than the West Coast Main Line. Transport-wise, it's going to make Bradford another Leeds and another Manchester. Manchester, as you probably know, does have a through route, although not many people seem to know about it. All this for 19 miles of double track that had to be built. It's going to cost about £1.25 million. £500,000 was on the tunnel under Low Moor to get here, and the viaduct across Foster Square. They bought the line, they bought the route, and in fact it was built from Royston as far as a place called Thornhill, which is more or less Dewsbury. And somebody wrote not all that long ago that the unfinished embankment was like a solitary finger pointing north. Still there now, if you go down there. There was a goods branch finished to Dewsbury, and this massive a place called Saviltown at Dewsbury was built, a huge, huge goods yard with little bit of track going across it and a couple of sidings, and that was it. That's where the station was going to be. The Huddersfield line was opened, but if you go and look at it where it was going to be, again, it's a massive part of central Huddersfield, and it's got huge walls down either side of it, classic Midland stone walls, worthy of the Great Northern, actually. But they never bothered building the station. I'll come on to why they never bothered in a due course. And he had a bit of goods traffic over these two routes. And the land was bought right the way up the M606 route, right down to here. In fact, I used to work with a bloke called Jim Patchett at Yorkshire Bank here, across the road at Broadway when it was here. And he was a very wealthy chap, was Jim, and he worked because he didn't need to, he just liked it. And I said, where did Ollie Brass come from, Jim? And he said, my great-granddad used to own a building in central Bradford. He said, and it was right on the route of the West Riding lines, and the Midland paid a fortune for it. And eventually, the council bought the land off the Midland, and the Midland made a profit on the land. They didn't build it in 1894 for a very good reason, but I'll come to that in a minute. There was another act in 1911 which was more for political reasons than anything, and they'd no real intention of proceeding. The reason it didn't happen was, if you don't know a lot about the relationship between the Midland Railway and the London and North Western, this won't make a lot of sense. But there were phenomenal arguments between the two organisations over the years, and they fought for every bit of traffic. And the North Western had made a colossal error in 1869. And what had happened in 1869 was the Midland had a line from here to a place called Ingleton, which you may have heard of. And at Ingleton, the North Western had built a line from the West Coast Main Line to meet them head on, to stop the Midland getting through to the West Coast Main Line. Does that make sense? I think it does. And that way, they could have got through to Carlisle that way and used running powers. The North Western was determined that that wouldn't happen, so they built this branch line to Ingleton to physically stop them. The Midland then went and said, okay, we'll build a railway from Settle to Carlisle. Anybody not heard of the Settle Carlisle Railway? Yeah, it's fairly well known. And the Midland got the Act of Parliament, and they were clearly going ahead with it. The North Western said, we've made a mistake, chaps. It's all right. We will actually allow you onto the West Coast Main Line, so you don't need to build a Settle Carlisle. And the Midland said, thank God for that. 4 million quid. You know, we don't really want to do this. And so they tried to abandon it, but Parliament wouldn't let them abandon it. And it was pressure from two other railways, the Lancashire and Yorkshire, and the Glasgow and South Western, sorry, three, the North British as well, who all said, hang on a minute, we've built new routes to connect with the Midland to use the Settle Carlisle, and now they're not going to build it, so we've wasted all this money. And Parliament said, bit of bad luck you're having there, lads, you've got to build it. So they built the Settle Carlisle, and consequently, the London and North Western had effectively created a stick to beat their own back with. Yeah, if that makes sense. And they were determined that that wouldn't happen again. And the danger with the West Riding lines was that that would happen again. So what they did, they did not want that 19 miles of track building through West Yorkshire. And so when the Midland was part way on with it, the North Western came to them and said, how about if we have a traffic agreement and we pool all our Scotch traffic, not Scottish traffic, Scotch traffic. It's always called Scotch traffic on the railways. How about if we pool it? And the Midland said, oh yeah, we'd love to do that. The price for it, by the way, is that you don't build the West Riding lines. And the Midland said, no problem at all. So we don't really want to do it because we're doing to you what we did with the Settle Carlisle. Does that all make sense? And so they just stopped it completely. And that was in 1910. So all the work on it that started under the 1894 Act was literally just stopped. That caused Halifax Chamber of Commerce, Bradford Council, the County Council in West Yorkshire, Huddersfield Council, loads and loads of political pressure was brought on the Midland. And that was why the 1911 Act came in to say, actually, we're going to, no, we'll do it. We promise you we'll do it. But they'd no intention of proceeding. But it was a political ploy, was the 1911 Act. As you can see there, the LNW gave loads and loads of running powers and a traffic agreement to the Midland. The LNY did the same in 1911 and gave permission to the Midland to use its entire network south of Bradford. So the Midland just had no need then for the West Riding lines. Was it a waste of money? Well, not really, no. It was a business, was the Midland, and it was there to make money. And why should it spend £1.5 million finishing the West Riding lines when it had got what it wanted without them? Goods traffic did use the route a little bit. Lancashire and Yorkshire oddly enough, paid to use them for a Halifax-Sheffield passenger service and a Bradford to St Pancras service. The Midland worked through coaches to Halifax and Huddersfield. There's one or two other reasons there. Lots of excursion traffic over them. And they made a profit on the land. They sold it in 1920 to Bradford Council. Well, that's Bradford Council all over, is that? After the grouping, after 1923, there was absolutely no point to do it. The LMS did actually say to the council, yeah, we'll do it, we'll still do it, honestly we will, but they'd no intention. The strategic need for it had gone. Who was going to build a route through the West Riding purely for local traffic? Nobody would. The LNWR, the LNY and the Midland were now under common control, the LMS. There was just no point whatever to do it. But oddly enough, there is a through route through Bradford, but it's not north-south, it's east-west. And it's, there we are, if anybody knows the geography, it's Bowling Junction to Leicester, and it was a cut-off. Those of you who've come from Leeds into the interchange, as you start to drop down the hill into Bradford, you start to drop down at a place called Leicester, which is there, just there. Gasworks siding, it's wonderful, isn't it, that Gasworks siding. And there was Vitriol Junction just round the corner as well. There was a Vitriol, there still is a Vitriol Junction on the Calder Valley line as well. But you can see that's the route down, that's the route down into Exchange there. You see that? So that's the route you go now, but into Interchange, that's where Interchange is. And then you come out and go off that way to Manchester. But as you can see, there's this route there. Can you see it? Going along there through Bowling. And in fact, that was open from the 1850s until 1964, so that trains from Liverpool to Newcastle and Manchester and Liverpool to Leeds didn't have to call at Bradford Exchange, and they went that way. It was a real main line built for high-speed running, and it was. Bowling station there was used as a station for Bradford, and you could put that back in tomorrow. Again, if you want to do a bit of industrial archaeology tonight, then go trotting round Bowling Back Lane. You'll enjoy Bowling Back Lane, it's interesting. But do go there, there's a couple of good pubs there, but I'd put your tin hat on if I were you. And it's all still there, and it's reserved, one of the West Riding reserved routes, which are there in case they're ever needed again. And in fact, it's rumoured that that's going to be one of the routes that the tram's going to take, if it ever happens. So next time you go south on the M1, cross the Calder Viaduct, over to the right, as you go in towards London, you'll see a massive, huge viaduct, a place called Cannon Hall. And over it, that's the West Riding lines. It's a colossal viaduct that hardly ever carried any trains. Climb up to Woolly Edge, and as I mentioned earlier, you'll see on your left, as you go over a derelict bridge on the M1, there's the yawning mouth of Criggleston Tunnel, which is a fantastic thing. Or wander around Eastern Huddersfield and look at these massive earthworks that were hardly ever used. And remember, Bradford's railway that never was. Thank you.
Right, we've got a little bit of time for
They
questions.
said I had to finish to give time for questions at 1:45, and it's 22 now, so finish bang on time. Right,
Thank you
good.
very much. Does anyone have any questions or comments that they'd like to share?
Hello.
Hello.
You stressed passenger traffic.
Yeah,
What about goods traffic?
I thought you might ask about that. There was
In that
no
case,
real
you
need.
could have answered it in your lecture.
Yeah, no, there's enough in it, or it was far boring enough as it was. No, there was no need for the goods traffic. There were so many odd little bits round Bradford that the goods could go on. There was a strange route from Shipley, which went, if I go right back to the beginning, I can show you it. Very, very odd route. Let me just get it up there. There you are. Can you see that? Shipley on the Midland. The Great Northern had that route there. So that was a through route, and it was used as a through route for goods. And it's still there through a place, splendidly named place called Idle. Yeah. There was this route there, which you can't see a lot of, but it went that way and then went round in a massive circle up to Keighley. So that was a way of getting goods round the centre of Bradford. It just wasn't necessary. And if it was long distance goods, if you're coming from Scotland, you could send it round through Manchester, you'd turn off at Hellifield, and there just wasn't a need for it. The vast majority of goods around Bradford was coal coming in for the mills, and there was a huge goods yard there. The vast amount came in or out, but for through goods traffic, they would send it either around Hellifield, then down to Manchester, or the Great Northern would have used one of those two routes.
Great, thank you very much. Do we have any more questions?
It was either brilliant or awful, I'm not sure which.
It was fantastic, thank you so much. In that case, we've got an afternoon cup of tea to go and have now. So if you could join me to thank David for his presentation, that'll be lovely. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, everybody. So we come to the customary Saturday afternoon session of AIA's award winners. One of the important things the association does is to recognise excellence in publication, in conservation, and similar activities. And so I'll talk about the people who aren't here later, but we have we're very pleased to have 3 award winners with us this afternoon who are going to talk a little bit about the work that's won their award. They will be receiving their certificates after dinner. That's one way of making sure they don't leave early. They don't get their certificates now. They have to sing for their supper. But they are here to talk about their work. I should be standing here, so I'm told. I shouldn't wander about. The first one is Ian Jackson, who is the winner of the dissertation award for his PhD thesis, Climate Change Mitigation, Learning from the Past to Unlock the Hydropower Potential Derbyshire Derwent Catchment. Now, Ian's done his PhD at Nottingham in Department of Geography, which is an interesting sort of, it's a trend we're seeing with a lot of the dissertation awards now, that they're coming from geography departments rather than archaeology departments, which is good as long as they come. We don't mind where they come from. So I'll just no more ado. I'll hand over to Ian Jackson. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will go through this. Is it about 15 minutes? 4 years research, 1 thesis, 100,000 words. So apologies. It is edited. So the story is looking at the climate change issues and the local community group. We were looking for renewable energy. I live in Belper. We have the Belper mills, and we didn't know whether we were making hydroelectricity or not. So that's 2010. The story is that yes, there are some industrial sites, historic industrial sites are making hydroelectric power. That's Masson Mills, Belper, and Derby. But there's plenty of other mills that have produced hydroelectric power in the past, but aren't doing today. So they were opportunities. And for groups of us all over the country, we were working as communities to try and reinstate and generate hydroelectric power. And my particular project, which was at Ambergate, we worked on that from about 2012 till 2018, when every hydro project in the country stopped. For regulatory reasons, for financial reasons, but basically it's almost impossible to do hydro today, which led to 2 years of sulking, but then eventually going away and doing a PhD, saying, well, what's gone wrong? How do we unlock all this potential that's there? And being based in Belper, what lessons can we learn from the people like the Struts who managed to achieve so much with the same resources? So 1 slide on the process of the PhD. It was to look at the OS maps for the Derbyshire Derwent catchment and colour them in. I started this during lockdown 2020, so colouring in an OS map was great fun. I had nothing better to do, and I came up with a complete list of about 195 water power sites. Small mills, but also large industrial mills. The large ones, Derwent, the River Derwent, and the key tributaries. For each one of those sites, I then tried to develop a timeline starting from 17 59, when Smeaton did his work, which ties in very nicely with the talk earlier, to date. Some mills, there's barely a record of a mill being there, but other mills, like Belper mills, there is volumes of information. So it's mixed. But I built a timeline for every mill. And one of the surprises for me was how many of those sites in Derbyshire had produced hydroelectric power in the last 100 years. They weren't doing today, but they had done in the past. So those dots there represent, green dots are currently generating hydroelectric power. Amber dots, there is evidence that a turbine was installed to make electricity, but it wasn't doing today, which was a surprise. Over 40 sites just in the Derwent catchment. So going through these timelines, there were some key lessons, some very interesting aspects to learn. So one of the more interesting ones, I'm not saying relevant for my research, was about water power development and how through the 1700s with your arkwrights and your struts, they were still restricted by the wooden water wheel. And I honestly don't know how many people are aware of these wheels that were developed by William Strutt at Belper. Still restricted by wooden, but he needed more power output for his cotton mills. He built two extraordinary wooden water wheels. The first one being 48-foot long and 12-foot diameter. And then after he raised the weir, he had the opportunity to build an 18-foot by 40-foot diameter. These were strapped on either side of the West Mill. Anybody who visited Belper at that time wrote about it. There's just some extraordinary writing, the noise, the scale, and possibly accidentally, he also developed the idea of the flood wheel. He'd got a redundant 12-foot wheel and he lifted it, and it meant that could run when the river level was high. So he was a smart guy. The North Mill built down on the complex in 1803. It was rebuilt with an 1804 wheel, which seems to be a hybrid development, and we're starting to see parts of iron wheels being introduced. And that's why I asked the question earlier about Smeaton. There has got to be a link with Smeaton, William Jessup, and William Strutt. But the most significant development was this iron suspension wheel. And I know how much research and discussions go on about steam, but at the period, whilst there was this competition, the iron suspension wheel took the maximum output from something like 40 horsepower for a wheel up to 200. It was a game changer for sites that had the river to be able to do it. And certainly in the Derwent Valley, these iron suspension wheels spread very quickly on the large industrial sites. They were only economical for the big industrial sites. So we've got a period of time now where we've gone from a wooden water wheel to the iron suspension wheel. And initially steam developments were supporting water power. So they were recirculating the water. And this is one of my favorite pictures I managed to find. And it's actually in Sutton in Ashfield in Nottinghamshire. They were recirculating water onto the water wheel, and they tried to do it by wind power. So this is in the 1780s. So talk about renewable energy back in the 1780s. Now, it didn't work, and you had to add steam, but that's what steam was originally used for in terms of power. It was for recirculating the water. But steam power developed, and it became more efficient. And by the 1830s, steam was as efficient, more efficient than water power. And that's what enabled the growth in the industry. But water power continued and continues to be developed. In the late 1850s, late 1800s, you started to see turbines that were slightly more efficient than the iron suspension wheel. So somebody's mentioned Mythbusters once already, and the number of times I hear people talk or I read, and the impression that water power started the Industrial Revolution, then it was replaced by steam. And I've even got a book about Belper Mills, and it said the chimney went up in 1854, therefore water power stopped in 1854, which is absolute rubbish. And my evidence of the Derbyshire Derwent, any site that had water power continued to use it. Where they needed more power, they added steam. And we were in a world of hybrid power, where we had the baseline of water power and steam on top. So at Belper Mills, when it grew, and we're talking 1912 now, when the big growth went on, they had 10 water turbines plus 2 very big steam turbines. And this was all of the big industrial sites in the Derbyshire Derwent, that was the pattern, that they continued to use water power plus steam. It was hybrid. We then start seeing a new change and a new development in power and energy, and that's this invention of electricity. Most people are familiar with the Crag site, hydroelectric power first, electricity generation, and I've put that photograph in as well. I'm still fascinated. I don't hear many people talking about the battery that they had associated with it, which still amazes me that they had batteries installed in the first turbines. But this was happening not just at Cragside, it then happened very quickly at similar homes. And so not too surprising for anybody who knows Derbyshire, Chatsworth House weren't a million miles behind. And again, they had a battery development in their chargers. And in doing the research and talking to the people at Chatsworth, I said, you haven't got any glass bowls by any chance, have you? And they said, well, we've got them in the sheds and we don't know what they're for. I said, hang on to them, they're your old batteries, we can use those. So that if those were being rolled out. And when I looked at Gilks, Gilks were the major water turbine supplier. When you look at their 1898 list of users, well, it starts off with Queen Victoria, and that keeps going on. Even a few years ago, Balmoral were taking all the activity. But yeah, you start off with the Queens, then the Dukes, the Earl, Marques's, Earls. It was being used, hydroelectric power, if they wanted lighting and they had the opportunity of a river, a stream, or a mill, then they used them. This again was most surprising because I knew of 3 Gilks turbines in Derbyshire when I started looking at it, and I'd been looking at it for about 10 years. Through the British Hydro Association, I've got to know the company, and somebody said, would you like to have a look at our old records for Derbyshire? And I said, well, yes, please. And they copied these for me, and these are the ledgers. And they're the turbines that they supplied just to Derbyshire. So these are all water turbines making electricity. And they've got one of these ledgers for every county in the country. I had hoped to go and see them before this, so I could give you some idea of how many other turbines there might be. So they were being used far more widely than they ever suspected. So you could make your own electricity and you could generate your own electricity, and that's what was happening. But in parallel, we're now starting to get the large coal-fired power stations making electricity. So first of all, they start making them in quantity, but then the big step in the 1940s, 1950s, we moved to the national grid system. And it was, in hindsight, you might say it's different, but it was the government policy in the early 1920s to say, we've got this coal resource, we need to use it, we need to take the best advantage we can. And so that's why coal became king. And then when they nationalized the industry, they then had to shut down local generation to make it efficient. So it was a bit of a coal and sticks where they were giving people big contracts to buy the electricity from the coal fire rather than making their own. And this is where you start seeing people turning off turbines, local generation. And we also had water board, a new water board that needed to clean up the rivers. How do you raise money to do that? We charge these people that are taking water out, which was the hydro guys, even though they're putting it straight back in. And that helped kill off effectively an industry. That is the Gilks turbine sales for the 1900s. And you can see how busy it was in the early 1900s when you could make your own electricity. There was no grid. So if you wanted to make it, you had to make it yourself. But then you can see what happened in the 1960s, 1950s. Gilks only survived by exporting turbines because you couldn't install them. Basically, the grid was it. There was this little purple patch here. So we've now got climate change, we understand climate change, and we have feed-in tariffs, and we start doing reinstatement. So there was a little burst, and that's when I was active. But then 2018, it starts dropping off again. So as an example, so a water company installed this Gilks in 1955. Just a few years later, it's redundant, and there are potentially hundreds of these all around the country still today. And very recently, that same turbine has been refurbished and reinstalled at the Cromford Mill site. So at Cromford Mills, they've recently, in the original wheel pit, Cromford 2 wheel pit, they've put a wheel and a turbine. So the wheels are it's only about 5 kilowatts, but it's fascinating to watch, and it gets the public talking about it. But actually, the larger turbine's tucked away, and people don't even know it's there. But it's been a reused turbine, and there are hundreds potentially of those available out there. So that's the story of the power line. We've got into a situation where now we're moving to the offshore wind, solar. We were starting to, people may have heard of these Archimedes screws, which is the fish-friendly version of a turbine. And we were starting to see these being installed, but at the moment, I've put that in red because I think it's a halt for the foreseeable. And that's really what my PhD was about. And I told somebody earlier, I've got a meeting planned on Wednesday with the Minister for Water. But as they've just pointed out, there's a very good chance that she's either been moved by now or, so I haven't checked the news, so that might be cancelled, but we'll see. So other lessons to learn. People are going out there looking for hydropower sites. There's no need. In 1800, there was no opportunity really. Steam wasn't that competitive. So every water power site that was available was taken. And these guys optimized them. So this is a little bit of the story. Struts in Belper and Ambergate was the next mill up. So he built his first weir and it took the water levels back up to where the land boundary was. He built his second weir and raised it a few feet. And it took the water and it interrupted with the iron forge at Alderworsley and they started falling out. And they raised it a bit further and they really fell out. But they ended up rebuilding a long tail race and having all of that power put at a higher site. So it was a compromise at the end of the day. But this was happening all over the country. There were loads of lawsuits. So we don't need to go to look for these sites. They're all out there. The weirs are still out there. Some of the weirs are still out there. This is the single biggest concern and the one that I'm trying to flag up to as many organisations as I can. These industrial weirs are under serious threat. So a lot of them aren't being used for their original purpose, whether it was power, flood management, whatever their original purpose, they weren't. And so now they're a liability and they are falling down. Derby Silt Mill, the famous Looms Derby Silt Mill, people never ask about the weir. Well, that was because it collapsed in the 1960s and it just got taken away because it was a flood risk. And a lot of existing weirs could go the same way because owners really aren't interested. The second threat is that our agencies currently in the UK view industrial revolution weirs as the reason we no longer have salmon in the rivers. And so there is an active and very, very well-funded programme to remove weirs and at least bypass them. That's a bypass in Nottingham. It's just cost £12 million. There's 7 other weirs the other side the fish can't get over, but never mind. So this is a programme that I'm trying to say this is not necessarily true. And I'm very pleased that within the research, I wasn't expecting it, but there was evidence that that's not true. Or it's not the whole truth, sorry. Mill owners back in 1800 were interested in the fish as much as they were, well, more than we would be today, both from a food, but also from a fisheries point of view. So the struts at Belper, there's a record, 1817, they've constructed a very complete pass for salmon going up the Derwent to spawn. So all of the mill owners must have been working together to be able to facilitate fish passage. And that was a clue that led to 2 years worth of research. Charles Dickens was talking about, we're going to lose the salmon in the 1860s, but he's now talking about poisons in the river, not just the weirs. The salmon inquiry of 1860, there is, I think, 900 pages worth of evidence of mill owners, fishermen, all over the country. If ever you want to know what the rivers were like in 1860, that's the document, and it's not in the public domain, but it's an amazing resource. The Salmon Fisheries Act came as a result. It protected milling power because it was so important to the country. Improvements could be made for fisheries, but it was at the cost of the conservator, not the miller, which is not the situation today. They introduced nightly close times and introduced weekly close times. And you ask anybody at the Environment Agency why we have weekly close times and why it's still in law, none of them know. They have no idea. Oh, it's weird, it's old. What it was that the weekly close time matched mill shutdown time. And it was described, a training guide for conservators said basically upper proprietors want the salmon. So all of the others, they open the gates, they open the sluice gates, open the floodgates on a Sunday, and the fish could literally redistribute themselves. It's quite simple, but not understood. In parallel in the inquiry, they mentioned pollution in the 1860, and the fact that 1952 is one of the most important pollution in river law cases that ever took place just below Derby, means that for 90 years, the Derwent was polluted so badly that fish couldn't survive. There's a massive, very important case about pollution in the 1950s, and it dealt with trade effluent, it dealt with population growth, council responsibility. It was important, but it does mean the river was effectively dead for 90 years. So all of the weirs built in the 20th century, so the Derwent Valley, dams and reservoirs, the gauging weirs associated, the Riverlands project, which straightened the river through Derby to reclaim land. None of this included any fish passage, even flood weirs. There were no fish in the river, so why would they do fish passage? So the 20th century weirs are a problem, not the Industrial Revolution weirs. So what lessons can we learn about the Industrial Revolution weirs? Well, those sluices and those floodgates, they managed the floods, and they still manage floods today in one or two sites. Most of them are derelict. The Environment Agency, if they don't own it, it's not counted as a flood management asset. But fortunately in Belper, the team who run the hydro look after those gates, and they open them when it's flooding. They were used to control the rivers. So for a period of time in Belper, they had to run below weir height to not upset Ambergate. And they did that by opening one of the sluice gates, which meant the sluice gate was open all the time. Fish didn't have to jump over the weir if there's a gate open. They supported navigation. This is a 1740s, a whole series of sketches. One artist, he went around, and there's 4 or 5 from Derbyshire. They are fabulous, and they show how the locks worked through the weirs. But certainly south of Derby, navigation was supported by opening the floodgates on a Sunday. So that's when the boats were allowed to move up and down the river. And then one of the amusing finds for me for the AIA, they supplied me the information. They didn't know they'd supplied me the information. 1984, fish pass design in the Minister of Agriculture and Fresh Fisheries, I'm not sure, 1984, was an undershot sluice that you could use for fish passage. Now, I don't know how many 4-gate sluices there are in the country, but that does not look like the Belper Weir. So I'm going back to the Environment Agency, and they are now working on a project to see if we can support fish passage through Belper using the sluices and not building a £250,000 stainless steel fish pass. And everybody who talks about fish passage says, well, they can't jump over the weir. This salmon was quite smart, and this was last December, and he just took the left weir, which was smaller, and swam under the gate, which just changed all the thinking that there are salmon there and they can get through using the gates. So the summary is there are lots of weirs down the valley that could get reinstated and be making hydroelectric power, and it could boost it. It's not going to run the counter. It's going to be 5 to 10% of our power needs, but it's there and available. But there's all these other gates and sluices and floodgates that we could be using to help manage the river better, as people like the Struts did many, many years ago. Thank you.
Okay, right. So that our next award winner is the winner of what we tend to regard as perhaps our most prestigious award. You're right. Oh, you do that bit. Okay. The Peter Neveson Award for Outstanding Scholarship in Industrial Archaeology, named after and funded by a legacy left by Peter Neveson, who was a prominent member of AIA, who died about 20 years ago. I'm sure many of you in this room will remember Peter.
Thank you.
And many of you in this room will be familiar with our winner, who has been a member of AIA. Well, she was a member of council in 1983, I think. She joined it, and she managed to get away from AIA council, and then I dragged her back last year because she took over from me as co-editor of IA Review, our journal, when I took over as secretary. So she's been dragged back, kicking and screaming onto AIA council, but she's here to talk about this splendid book, which I guess is sort of distillation of many, many years, if not a lifetime's research into your pet subject. It is called The Buildings of the Malting Industry, Production of Malt from Prehistory to 21st Century. It's one of these splendid Historic England, Liverpool University Press books. So I will hand over to Amber. Thank you.
Right. Thank you. Can you all hear me? That's the first thing. Right. The book is published by Liverpool University Press, commissioned by Historic England in 2018. Due to various matters, I couldn't start work on the writing aspect until 2019. And I got so far, and something happened in 2020. The consequence of which is that although I would say that the text, in other words, the written words are as one would expect, it did undoubtedly have an effect on the book itself. The illustrations, I wouldn't say are limited, but they, not all were my first choice, and a great many more were my own images as opposed to elsewhere, because I could not go to archives to look at them. I couldn't do field work to look at them. I did do a lot of online work, and that is where the internet comes in and is absolutely invaluable, because what I was able to do very conveniently from home was all the county archives online catalogues. Now, it is fair to say that not all their material is in their online catalogue, but certainly a large proportion is. And there are various other online activity searches that I could make. The book, I should say, for anyone who wants to buy it, and I'm sorry because there isn't a copy here today, is available from bookshops. But if anyone is thinking about it, I would advise them to go on to Liverpool University's website and buy it from there, because there is a discount on it. And since that's obviously a reserved copy, don't take it away. It's Ian's. I didn't dare bring mine because I thought that might walk. Believe it or not, I actually find a use for it at home. So, as you can see from the title, and this is the image that is on the front of the book, it's the buildings of the malting industry, the production of malt from prehistory to the 21st century, which is a very long time period. And I'm going to make a little plug here, because the prehistory, yes, I'd already done some prehistory work, but a lot of it was done, again, as I've mentioned, by the internet and Archaeological Data Service, the Grey literature, because that was absolutely invaluable. As a starting point, yes, you could then go and look up individual journals, but it's worthwhile remembering that that is a very good source of information. Right, I'll come on to that in a minute, but am I pressing the wrong thing? Page up. It's making a noise. Oh, I'm obviously not doing it.
Down there.
Down arrow. Right. In the beginning, I'm often asked, as Ian said, this is years of research, where I started and how I got into it. The building on the left is the first malt house I encountered. I know it doesn't much look like one, and I certainly didn't know that. Was the start of my other research, which is my first job after university, which was down in Devon on a quay, Moorlam Quay on the Tamar. And the main interest there was copper mining, copper ore export, etc. But being diligent, when I went through the archives of the Duke of Bedford's Tavistock estate papers, was something on a malt house. It was built at the end of the 18th century, was out of use by the middle of the 19th century, and this was it. When I went for my next job interview, which was in Nottinghamshire, which with hindsight actually was very important, I was asked, had I come across these buildings called malt houses? Which I answered, yes, quite truthfully. I have to say it was fortunate they did not ask me anything else because that was the sum total of my knowledge. Yes, it was built, it was converted, end of story. So, in Nottinghamshire, I was required to do various industrial archaeology surveys, one of which eventually was malt houses. And this is really where things started off. This is 1975. The main book, modern book, was Branch Johnson's Hertfordshire. If I wanted anything else, it was 19th century publications. Well, there were an awful lot of malt houses in Nottinghamshire, and luckily I went round some of them. The one on the right, Baird's Malt, had ceased production about the year before, and I went round that one, not working. The one on the left was the second, I wouldn't say necessarily the second one time-wise that I went round, but it was the first working malt house, Peaches. That closed in 1980. I will just say something else here. Most of the slides I'm showing you are my own copyright. There are 3 that are not. So you're quite welcome to take images of mine, but if you want the ones that are not, and they are marked up, please see me later on. So we've got as far as my being interested in malt houses and finding out quite a lot about them. So we'll have a quick whiz at the malting process because it is quite important to understand this, because if you don't understand it, you don't understand the buildings that I'm going to come on to. And it is also worth pointing out that quite a lot of people writing about malt houses, that's not including Branch Johnson, do not understand the process. Barley is the main grain that is malted. It isn't the only one. Barley in, stored, cleaned, steeped, couched before 1880, malt tax in operation. Germinated, in other words, it grows. And then when it's grown to the required extent, you kiln it. Kiln drying floor, furnace, and out again when it's dried to something like 3% moisture content. I won't go into all the sorts that you can make. You store it historically for a month. You clean the rootlets off it. It doesn't grow shootlets. So we now know the process, don't we? Hopefully. And I'm going to give you a few facts before we go on. People think of the malting industry as a rural one. It is not exclusively a rural one. Towns had a substantial number of malt houses, and I put them up here. 1609, Bridlington had 53 kilns. I have not done the research for this, but I'm quite satisfied that it is good quality research. By the end, or nearer the end of the 18th century, Tewkesbury, and Tewkesbury is really rather small when you think about it, Gloucestershire, has 42. There are 76 in Derby. If we go elsewhere, by the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, I could bring in Warminster. And there's Dave Perrott here somewhere. I don't like to say this, but Pontefract had quite a lot of malt houses. And one of them was certainly working into the mid 1990s. The patenting of Coke in 1636 was for the malting industry, not for iron smelting. It's obviously much more important. And I'm not quite sure why they decided to patent Coke, because they weren't using charcoal. The medieval fuel for kilning malt was actually wheat straw. Yes, it burns better, more slowly than barley straw. Barley straw is too combustible. And there are, of course, other fuels, again, which I'm not going to go into here. See me later. And the first turnpike road, the Great North Road in 1663, was turnpiked because of the damage malt wagons were causing on their way into London. The London market is a tremendous draw, and it's a draw all the way through. So let's go on to early kilns. This is actually a medieval one. Prehistory, they are quite often referred to as corn drying kilns. There is certainly work to indicate that corn drying was probably not the main use, because you can't dry enough corn to store it adequately. You could certainly use them to in the same way that you use corn drying kilns associated with water mills at a later date. In other words, just before you're going to mill your grain. Here, you're using it for malting. And the other thing you've got to remember is the cost of building these, constructing these. This is a medieval one. It's at Kimberley, or was at Kimberley in Nottinghamshire. The image is such that I took it when it was being excavated. It is, however, a standard design. This one happens to be what I would refer to as an inverted pyramid, stokehold towards the front there. They could be conical. There is plenty of literature available to show this, and as I said, this is a standard design. Oops, no, I think I've gone too far. Have I gone too far? Yes. The 16th century. Boyscroft, a Great Dunmow. The image on your left is before it was done up. It is now partly a museum, and it is certainly very much available. How do I know it's 16th century? If you look at the right-hand one, which is the upstairs, again early on, and you look at the timber beams, they have been dated quite correctly. I have to assume that it's correct, and showing that it's 16th century. So we've got actual buildings by the 16th century. 17th century, this is Chipping Campden in Gloucestershire. Somewhat variable. And how do I know it's 17th century? I think there is, EH would say, or HE would say, well, probably early 18th century. It is in fact the red stonework, because in the Civil War, the big house in Chipping Campden was burnt down, and the stonework from it, which was burnt, became red, was used in various buildings around the town, and we've got them here. That's an urban one. There is no doubt that water transport starts to becomes very important. I've mentioned the pull of the London market, and a lot of malt went round the coast from East Anglia. Not this one. It also went round the south coast. It went down the Thames. It went down the Lee. In fact, anything, you could send it down. Water transport becomes very important, and this is Stowmarket and the Gipping navigation, end of the 18th century. This is actually an L-shaped building with a kiln at the other end, and it's, I think, quite a typical elevation onto the navigation. And that's river navigation. We now go on to canals, and this is, sorry, it should be 19th century water transport. Well, 18th century into 19th century. This is 19th century. This is the Chesterfield Canal at East Retford, and a very large malt house. Unusually, we'd have a more or less build date for this, and it's 1830s. So you've got 4 stories there, just about. The kiln, which is in between Major Flower Oak and the malt house itself, I think maybe almost certainly is a slightly later edition, but the plan, and there is a plan that goes with this, does show a kiln in that point and other features. I've put this in 19th century transport. We come into railways, and I don't think you can really see it very well for everyone here in Bradford, because this is CE Seed Limited, and they had their maltsters, they had their head office at Clayton in Bradford. This building is not in Bradford, it is in Worksop in Nottinghamshire. Their archives, when I was consulting them, which I think would probably be the 1990s, were in the West Yorkshire archives in Leeds. Whether or not they've been moved to Bradford, it is a possibility. So that's that. I've mentioned Pontefract. Now, with hindsight, I should have put a few images in, because in fact, it's quite well covered in my book. I've got 2 images there. One is a drum malting Simpsons at Ferrybridge Road, and the other is on Bag Hill Lane, which is an earlier one. And that's the front of CEC. It's a much better one. It does appear in the book. You can see the white area. It is obviously suffered an unfortunate occurrence, and that usually means there's been a fire. And fires are unfortunately very common in malting, and they still happen. Built in 1875 for the Sheffield Brewers, and it last worked in 1975. And it was at that time operated by all brew maltsters. I had the opportunity of going around it before it was demolished. There's, I think, one wall left now, and it belongs to the Church of Jesus Christ, the Latter-day Saints. Worksop itself was an important malting town, and there were others. I think there might be one left on Eastgate. I think that's it. So we're progressing building-wise. As you can see, we've gone from timber framed, Boys Croft, to stone at Chipping Camden. We're now into brick. So we're looking at the buildings of the malting industry. It is probably fair to say that the building material will depend on what is locally available. I haven't shown them here, but here we've got slate roofs, and you'll get tile roofs. And you have thatched roofs, and you have thatched kilns. Let's put it this way. They seem to survive better than some of the ones that didn't. Whoops, and two. This is Barnetby in Lincolnshire, another brewery maltings. Similar date, 1875, railway line behind this building. Were that building standing today in its current condition, the short answer is I would not have been able to go over it because I trespassed with a colleague, to be fair. In the good old days, we didn't worry too much about health and safety. That doesn't mean we were unwise. Yes, you took precautions, and I would not go into that building like that with at least someone knowing that I was there. The plus is that if you're losing a building like that now, you will have no internal record unless it is listed, or unless you're very lucky. In this instance, actually this was listed, it's been demolished. But I had the opportunity, therefore, with my colleague, of going into at least parts of it. And this is one of the images, the bottom one, which is not my copyright. I have permission to use it. The top one, you will see, is it's a bottom floor, bottom germination floor, and you can see nice cast iron columns, jack arching, beams between the columns, etc. So in the book, I refer to this as being fireproofed on the Dennett system. The end of last year, early this year, I should say that I've had a lot of help from the malting industry itself. I'll come on to that slightly at the end. And one of the colleagues that I'm working with is also a retired maltster, and he is also very interested in history, not particularly the floor malting history. He's interested much more in pneumatic malting, and we correspond with each other, we send each other images, we discuss things. And he worked initially for Paul's Malt, and in the clearing out of another malt house, which is actually Baird's, he came across the bottom image. And I'm sorry, because I don't think you can see, but under the kiln area, there is a signature. And that copy is actually signed by Dennett. Yes, it would have been lovely if I'd had this when I was writing the book, but it's still very, very nice. I should say that I do actually have a hard copy of this as well as a digital image, and there is certainly much more. And you can see that it belongs to the brewery, it refers to it there. It's always nice to get confirmation, but I think it also confirms that at least at times they were taking account of fireproofing. We've looked at relatively small ones, but we do in fact build very, very large ones. And this is large, 1856, I think. This is one of four. I can't remember, I think this is number 20. Number 21 was demolished some time ago, 18 and 19 I've also been round. Large brick building, robustly built for Bass. Bass always built very robust buildings. It is a typical floor multi. By the end of the 1870s, before the repeal of the malt tax in 1880, we were also starting to use pneumatic. Now, this is pneumatic only, it is not mechanical. And this is the first one was actually at Beeston in Nottinghamshire. On the left-hand side is an image from Stokes. That actually is my copyright. And what I have done, because I had the advantage of seeing the plans for the Beeston maltings, it was to put in annotations to the drawings so that you can see how it worked. Flat bottom steep on the first floor, and it had to be flat bottomed because you're still within the malt tax regulations. The building, the exterior is on the top right-hand side. Subsequently, the plan, it was fortunately converted back from a pneumatic maltings to a floor maltings, which meant by Shipstons, which meant that they had to do building plans, which is where they come from. And the bottom one is when it was actually still in production. And if you look at the cast iron columns, they are in fact much closer together than would be normal on a malting floor. This is Saladin's box maltings, and this is both pneumatic and mechanical. The screws go up and down, turning it like you would turn on a floor germination by shovel in those days. So your screws do it instead, so it's labor saving in theory. Other pneumatic maltings were drum maltings. We have a turning drum. And at the same time that Bass were building Sleaford, beginning of the 20th century, 1906, well, Sleaford opens in 1906. They were also building their drum maltings in Burton. And I won't go into the tower, etc. The thing to look at are the windows, and it was very difficult to photograph this because there's a wall in the way. All maltings are difficult to photograph, but what it amounts to is if you've got much larger windows, you don't have to have the small windows that are so typical of floor maltings, the small square ones. And we'll have a look at some drums. These are modern drums, well, relatively speaking, at French and Jutts in Stansted Abbots. And you can see germination drum 2. The one beyond is turned. In other words, you turn so that what you're doing here, they're both pneumatic and they're mechanical in the sense that they are turning the grain, so you don't have to use a shovel. And I've just mentioned about Bass. And this is Sleaford maltings, the largest. Now, when I worked on maltings, and as you've gathered, this is from the 1970s onwards, with hiccups in between. I wasn't very keen on the Bass maltings. I didn't really like them, but they have grown on me. They are the most magnificent buildings, so robustly built. I think this one, I rather think I took this at an AIA conference, 2009. I might have been 2005, not for a conference, for something else. I first saw them in 1983, again, not for a conference, but because there was an application in to demolish. They've since been subsequently further fire damaged, and we are now not allowed near them in case they fall down. my personal comment is the likelihood of their falling down is pretty remote. I did go into these with permission. Modern maltings are not recognisable as such. That is Paul's Saladin plant at Gainsborough in Lincolnshire, the outside only. Some of them do have a bit more evidence. This one is not in my book. I did, when I was doing the book, try and ensure that I understood what I was writing about. I didn't understand that one. It's very modern. Same happened with a barley drying drum. So that's at Crisps at Great Ryborough. I was also tasked, not only did I have to deal with prehistory to the 21st century, I had to deal with building reuse. And to put it bluntly, throughout history, malt houses have been converted into other uses. The one I dealt with in Morwellum was converted into tenements in the mid-1850s. But previous to then, 18th century, they've been converted, and the other way around. Barns would go into malt houses, etc., etc. And that is still happening today. And I've put in the flax mill maltings. It's probably the best known, not necessarily best known conversion, but I'm going to say something else because I'm very keen on this with regard to this building. If this building had not been reused as a maltings in the 19th century, it would not have survived to be listed in the 20th century. And therefore, yes, technically it is extremely important as what is referred to as the forerunner of the skyscraper, but its malting industry is what saved it. And I think that is important to emphasize that. Just in case you wonder, that's what a germination floor looks like, and that's Warminster's copyright. And the last word must go to these working maltings, which in this case happens to be Warminster, and it's their copyright. I have to say that I had a tremendous amount of help from the industry, and I have to pay thanks are due to them. And it is always important to work with your industry if you can and get as much oral history. I can only give you a very light overview here. See me later on if you want anything else. Thank you.
So our final award tonight, this afternoon, is Publications Award, and it's for pictures. Now, the book is credited to National Grid. Our prize winner today, Russell Thomas, and Timu Tatalu. Is that right? Is that close? That's close. Sorry, I don't know it. I have known Russ quite a long time. Our paths have crossed in many events and projects and so on associated with the gas industry. He unlike most people involved interested in history of the gas industry, does not come from the gas industry. When I escaped from the gas industry to become an archaeologist, I was determined not to do anything with the gas industry. It keeps sucking me back, and particularly gas holders. I had a love-hate relationship with gas holders because I used to look after them at one point, and then I ran all the control rooms, which made them go up and down all around the country, so they were quite important in my life, I suppose. This is another splendid cooperation between Historic England and Liverpool University Press, and if you look back, they've dominated our awards for the past, I don't know how, 10 years probably. And this, I call this a coffee table book. I think so called because if you put legs on it, you could use it as such. But it is utterly splendid, and I do heartily recommend it. And just to explain, Russ, as I said, he's not from the gas industry. He's a specialist in land remediation. I think is that right?
One of my hats.
One of many hats. And another of your hats is visiting professor, University of Strathclyde, and a consultant for WSP Global. Yeah. And I'm sure Russ will explain how that all fits together with a passion for gas holders. So, are you ready?
Yes.
Forward on down there.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you both for the nomination and the the award as well. It was quite a surprise to find out the book had won an award. I didn't know it had been nominated. And it is quite simple in the concept. It's a book about gas holders that's told in pictures with a small narrative. So the book itself, as mentioned, was developed in partnership by National Grid. They paid for it. The idea was that this book would celebrate the end of National Grid Property Holdings, which managed the land portfolio associated with British Gas and its various forms through successor companies. And that company finally closed down earlier this year. And this book was there to support the work they'd done on bringing those sites back into regenerative use and to decommission around 300 gas holders that they had been tasked with decommissioning by Ofgem. So the concept, it was funded and edited by National Grid, so they had the overall say on what went in. It was supported by Historic England, so it was through their publisher, Liverpool University Press. And it was paid for by National Grid as well. It was written by myself. I wrote the first 11 chapters, and Timur helped write the final chapter on the future because he's more heavily involved in the redevelopment side. Which is published by Liverpool University Press. And I thought 10,000 words would be quite a lot to write this book, but actually it turned out to be very, very few words because that included the captions as well. So it has a very limited narrative, and that's on purpose. It was supposed to reach a broad part of the population who would be interested in these often fascinating structures on the townscape that people would see but wouldn't necessarily understand. And from that, we had to develop a narrative that went through the book. And I suppose one day I sat down and I thought, how could you approach this? So it's relatively straightforward. I started with an introduction and discussed the evolution, if that is the correct term, for how these gas holders developed. We'll go on to cover all the different types of gas holders. There are some that we haven't included, such as wire rope guided gas holders, just because there weren't sufficient quality photographs to include, and it would have been too difficult to include them in the short narrative that we had. We wanted to show how they were constructed simply and who constructed them, and their place both on the landscape and in society to show them in different settings, not just in major industrial cities. And we wanted a nod to the people who designed them as well, the engineers. And we also wanted to finish partly on a positive note that although many of these gas holders have now been demolished and removed from the landscape, there are still quite a large number on the landscape that have been preserved or included in future projects. And it was quite a challenge. It was difficult to produce a coherent narrative in only 10,000 words across, I think, 12 chapters. We only were allowed 250 images. I had to go through 5,000 different images to start off with over that amount. And these came through the work of IGEM. So John Horn, who's here today, was one of the people that did a lot of work to survey, to keep and maintain photographs, plans, other documents from the gas industry through the IGEM archive, and also for what survives in the National Gas Archive over in Warrington. And we were also very lucky to be given, because it was a Historic England book, access to Historic England's own archive. So recent photographs and also photographs from the past. So this gave us quite a broad selection of images to start from. And also from my involvement through IGEM and the gas industry, I've worked in it for about 27 years. I knew other people that were keen on gas holders and photographed them. So I got in contact with some of those, and they offered photographs of the book, and they provides a nice personal touch as well. One of the challenges was trying to keep a balance across the country. There's certain parts of the country, most notably London, that's much better recorded in terms of photographs in the collections. And there's other areas trying to get a balance across the northwest, the north, the Midlands. And we tried to do that, but there was a definite bias in the quality of the photographs. And then there was a challenge of selecting the final photographs. I came up with about 500 photographs that I liked from the collection. And then we had to take this to a panel, including National Grid and Historic England, decide what the final balance would be. And the overall editorial control was on National Grid. And then from that, we had to construct and edit the book. And the editing was fun because I'm dyslexic, so it gave the editors a bit of a challenge. So I just go through the chapters. I'm mainly going to keep it relatively brief, just to give you an idea of what's in the book. And this is a photograph of the original gasworks in Raleigh, Essex. So we obviously wanted to include important people, so we couldn't really go without William Murdoch. So we had to negotiate with the museum in Birmingham in order to access this photograph. We've also got a nice photograph of just a scene of the staff at the Old Resford Gasworks in Hampshire here. And then Historic England's own drawing, which came from some earlier work I did with Historic England on the manufactured gas industry, and they redrew a well-seen image from many gas textbooks. So we went on to the evolution of how these developed. So this is a drawing of Clegg's Dolphin Home gasworks, gas holder, one of the few surviving very early structures, the pits that there still survives today. And there's a photograph of that in the book in its present day form. Went also to a lot of effort to try and restore images such as Hutchinson's telescopic gas holder. I managed to get hold of a copy of this from a very early magazine, and I managed to restore it to make it more legible. We've also got some very quite unique photographs, such as this giant tripod gas holder that was at Fulham, which have been rarely seen before. And then also photographs that would provide a collection. So this one here is a nice photograph of a spiral, a frame guided, and a high pressure gas holder at a holder site in Raleigh in Essex. So the photographs go through the different aspects as the gas holder develops. Importantly, the telescoping as well, which made the gas holders able to contain a much greater volume of gas for the same surface of area of ground they took up. We also tried to include some nice photographs, including nature. This is Bradford Road, one of the two gas holders that survived there until recently. Then we went through the different typologies, going from the column guided, so the tripods first, which I showed you on the previous slide, and then the more ornate, perhaps the ones that have been best preserved because of their beauty in the structure of the columns and the framing. So this is an example here in Fulham, Portsmouth, and Bromley by Bow. These massive frames were very heavy, and the columns ultimately limited the size the gas holders could achieve. So from these heavy column guided gas holders, we moved on to the larger frame guided. So lighter structures using standards rather than the heavy columns. The lightness of the frames allowed them to be built much taller and store a greater volume of gas. And there were a number of moves, first from columns to standards that were first produced of cast or wrought iron, and then to steel, and then diagonal ties and wind ties that were added to the ever lighter framing, and moving from the strength being provided from the columns to the strength being provided by the wider cylindrical structure. So we've got another number of exos. That's the oval number 1 on the left, Dartford, the bottom, Southampton on the top, and Redhew. And at the top photograph here, you can just see some of the people stood on the gas holder, just to give a perspective of the size. And then moving on to spiral guided gas holders. I mentioned we could have done frameless gas holders and mentioned wire rope, but because we didn't have any decent photographs of wire rope gas holders, we just stuck to the spirals, which came to dominate the gas industry. So this was first suggested as a concept by W.H. Webber, and then Gavin Mason developed the first spiral guided gas holder. And it did away with the frame, so the external frame could then be, the strength from that could be achieved by reinforcing the lifts and using the heavy diagonal guide rails and special guide carriages. And these became the gas holders of choice in the 20th century. So I think this was bottom one is a gas holder built on an industrial site, because they were used to supply gas to industrial site. And this one was one Birksall here in Bradford, the one with the writing on it. I'm trying to think, I think the one was Hitchin, the one in the middle, yeah, which is a nice, quite rare photograph of the gas holder in the mist. You can't see the gasworks that went with it. Then on to the waterless type gas holders. This is Ipswich here. Waterless were not I say they're not a British idea. The first attempts were undertaken in York by Knapp. You tried using an Indian rubber diaphragm with a gas holder. They weren't very durable, and they didn't last very long. So they weren't used in earnest on gasworks until the German MAN company, Machine Fabric, Augsburg, Nuremberg, and Cloney, both German engineering companies, developed waterless gas holders. Well, they were a big, rigid external tank, and there was a piston that went up and down on the inside of the MAN gas holder piston. Was either oil or more typically coal tar sealed around the edges of the piston, and the Cloney was used heavy grease. I think this is Southall on bottom. Oh yeah, I should mention the Wiggins holder as well, a US design. It's shown here with a high-speed gas written on it. This came from mid-20th century. It has a piston with a rubber diaphragm attached to it, which expands it, goes up and drops down as well. So that's Canvey Island with the high-speed gas, LNG terminal, Swan Lane, West Bromwich, and this one on here, any local people will probably know, is York Minster, and the only Cloney gas holder that built on the network in Britain. A slightly different type of gas holder, and not always used for storing gas for distribution, were the high pressure gas holders, and these started to appear in the early 20th century. These are a couple of Horton spheres undergoing water spray testing in case of fires in, I think, Portsmouth. So the early gas holders used rivets. This collection here on the bottom left were known as the sausage and onion, and they were built on Canvey Island. The sphere at the back was the original gas holder for the high pressure local distribution system on Canvey Island. And then the sausage was built later on, and these were both built with riveted designs. There's a picture here of a gas holder being welded together in Abingdon, used for the local supply here. And this again, this Canvey Island, not strictly high pressure gas holders in the same way, but Canvey Island was the first liquefied natural gas reception terminal in the world, first as a trial and then as a second as a way that the Great Britain imported 10% of its natural gas before we converted to North Sea natural gas when that became available. It's just included in the book because it's a site of significance, both in the UK but also globally. So we wanted to try and include some photographs of construction. They were a bit limited by what we could use, but there's a nice photograph of people riveting a lift together here on the left. I think that's Crawley. A diver going in to do some maintenance work in Beckton. I would have not wanted to do that as a job. It's got to be one of the most dangerous things you could. Diving's dangerous enough, let alone going into the bottom of a gas hole. So it's an unusual photograph, and I thought it was interesting just on its own right to be included in the collection. This is Castleford on the top right, and that's just showing the inclusion of another lift that's been built and lowered into the gas holder tank. And the bottom right is Beckton. Beckton does get quite a lot of photographs in the book just because it's so well recorded, and that was the installation of a spiral guided lifts into the site of a gas holder that had been damaged in World War II. So move on to the gas holders on the landscape. We included this one just because it was a nice combination of a relatively rural setting with the obvious industrial site in the middle of a nice field, landscape field. This was Ascot in Surrey. And gas holders could be found in, as you see, there's Beckton in the middle in the colour here, in very, very obvious industrial settings, or on the skyline here on the left in Huddersfield. But they could also be found in relatively rural settings, such as Minehead here in the bottom with the pier. The coal was landed on the beach. And also Amersham up in the top right-hand section. They're often located next to waterways or ports, so they could bring in coal. Bringing in coal was one of the most expensive aspects of gas production, and you could also sometimes send out the byproducts. You would also find them on canals or railways as well. And you'd also find them at low point because gas was lighter than air, so it'd flow uphill better. Certainly in the early years, if you built a gas works at the top of a hill and you're trying to distribute it to the bottom, it would increase risks of leakage and make it harder to force the gas through the system. Gas and society wanted to show just a long history that gas had been. So 200 years of development, 9 monarchs. In the case of England, 10, if you include Scotland. There's 2 working gas holders still on the network in Scotland. Isolated networks at Stornoway and Campbelltown. They went through all things such as suffrage. So this photograph here shows you women working on their Bromley by Bow gasworks in London with the 4 women in charge of them. They were in companies such as the Gaslight and Coke Company, inspired a lot of art. And a clear picture today, a recently taken photograph by Historic England of Bromley by Bow gasworks, but with the big Canary Wharf in the background. And then just more simple settings like this is Poole with the bowling green in front of the 2. No, it's Bourne Valley actually, I think. Bourne Valley with the 2 gas holders behind. We wanted to include something about the engineers and manufacturers. This is Robert Paulson Spice, one of former presidents of the Institute of Gas Engineers, but also quite an interesting chap that he was a travel writer, and he was a self-taught engineer, built the surviving gasworks in Fakenham that exist today. there were many great engineers. They impacted people's lives. So George Livesey also introduced other important factors such as co-partnerships, such as you would see in a business such as John Lewis today. And tried to celebrate some of the companies and social factors such as the Windsor Street gas holders, which were painted in the colours of Aston Villa Football Club. We also challenged us again with some of the drawings we tried to use in the book, trying to improve the quality enough to survey people. And we also wanted to get in and the concept of the people that built these, because not only were there a lot of adults building them, also a lot of children, child labour involved, which wasn't uncommon at the time. Just give you an idea of just who was involved in this. And then we wanted to look at the future as well. So this is the CGI, as many of the pictures are on this slide, of Bethnal Green. There are gas holders that were not listed, but the company St. William decided to include them in the development, the two surviving column and frame guided gas holders. And this gives an idea of what it will look like. That development is quite advanced now. You can't go without talking about King's Cross. Many people will have seen it catching a train into London from St Pancras or into King's Cross station. Walking around that area, the gas holder park you can see, and then the triplet gas holders that have been converted into residential apartments. And also the Oval development here, which is coming on quite fast speed. Very different. King's Cross, the gas holders were taken apart, refurbished at Shepley Engineering in Yorkshire, and then reassembled on site. The Oval was more challenging, the fact that you can't really take the frame down, so that was put on special foundation on stilts, and then it's being refurbished in situ. And the internal tower has gone up in the middle of that Oval gas holder now. So that will be probably completed in maybe a couple of years' time. And Bethnal Green once again. There's also the Fulham development in London, and also the Bromley by Bow. There's the Lavenham gas holder has been restored recently, and there's work that's ongoing to redevelop the frame at Great Yarmouth, which is also listed. And there's outside of England, there's a number of great examples abroad, also Granton in Scotland, a great example of a refurbished frame, and then wonderful projects such as Gasometer City in Vienna, or even the Duisburg Diving Centre, which is a diving centre in an old gas holder. So there are many great examples globally, but we will have a fair number of excellent examples left in the UK after the end of life of these structures has been completed. So I would just like to thank the AIA and National Grid for allowing me to speak as well.
So two award winners who weren't able to be with us, I just wanted to give them a mention. The winner of the archaeological report, Alvaro Moro Ottomano, and the Community Engagement Award, the West Somerset Railway Association, couldn't be represented with us today. Those award presentations will take place at a future date. The other things to mention is that there are two awards we didn't make this year because we didn't have any nominations. Best Adaptive Reuse of Industrial Building and the Dorothea Award for Conservation. We didn't have any nominations for those, which is my excuse for giving a plug. We have the awards that AIA gives, I think, are a very important part of our work because they have quite a reach. They go out, we get publicity. We think it's a great way of banging the drum for industrial archaeology, but we need nominations, and anybody can make a nomination, and certainly any AIA member can make a nomination, and all the forms and everything are on the website. So if you read something or you see something, you know about a project, whatever, that fits with the criteria for our awards, then please whack in. The instructions are all there on the website. So we would like more awards. Okay, I shall shut up now.
Okay, that's the end of the session today. Now the more interesting part of the evening starts at about 6:15 when the bar and the French ballroom will be open. They'll be welcomed with a glass of wine or a beer. Soft drinks also available. The bar there, as I say, is open. There'll be a tab behind the bar for those who need top-ups at the reception before. The evening dinner starts at 7 o'clock in the French ballroom. You've all put your orders in for food, so I think you all know what you'll be getting. Towards the end of that event, I think we'll be making the formal presentations to the award winners who are here. I should be leaping about with my phone, taking photographs and things. Tomorrow morning, we start again at 9:45 when I shall be chatting here for a few minutes, telling you about the field visits. A field visit we did earlier in the year to Spain, and then 10 o'clock it's the AGM, and followed by the AIA annual Prestige lecture. That's all in your program. So looking forward to seeing you all in the area just outside the French ballroom for a drink at about 6:15.